Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's January 23rd, and my guest this week is Dr. Maja Mataric, and we're talking about how socially assistive robots will impact rehabilitation and caregiving. I just think that the work that Dr. Mataric is doing will be a game changer for people living with MS and other chronic conditions, as well as for their caregivers. And we're not talking about some science fiction view of the future. Dr. Mataric goes to work every day and creates the future. We're talking about technology that exists today and will start appearing in our homes tomorrow. And while it might not literally be tomorrow, you can be sure it's right around the corner. Dr. Mataric has been named one of the 25 most powerful women in technology and one of the top 25 women in robotics. So I hope you're as excited as I am to hear from her. But before we get to our conversation with Dr. Mataric, there are a few other things that you should know about. One of the things that happened while the podcast was on holiday break was that the Congress passed a new tax code and the president signed it into law. And by now, that's certainly not news, but I thought it might be helpful to review a few of the ways that the new tax code can have a specific impact on people living with MS. First off, you'll notice slightly less federal income taxes being deducted from your paycheck, and the IRS indicates that people could start seeing that change by February, so it's just about to happen. And in 2019, when you prepare your federal income tax return for 2018, you'll see that lower federal income tax burden when you look at the tax table that the IRS publishes every year. Now, how much lower your income tax burden will be is going to depend on where your income falls among the different tax brackets. The new tax code also eliminates the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate by eliminating the financial penalty for not complying. In other words, built into the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's sometimes known, was a financial penalty for individuals who did not purchase health insurance. But beginning in 2019, that penalty is eliminated. However, I can't imagine any circumstance where a person living with MS would think that opting out of their health insurance is a good thing to do. Now, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has projected that by eliminating this individual mandate, 13 million Americans will no longer have health insurance by 2027. But I'm really hoping that there isn't a single person living in the United States who's listening to this podcast who's even considering going without health insurance. Oh, and for those of us who will continue purchasing individual health insurance, the Congressional Budget Office also projects that by eliminating the individual mandate, our health insurance premiums can be expected to rise by about 20%. Also, the medical expense deduction currently allows individuals to write off medical and dental expenses that exceed 10% of their adjusted gross income on their federal tax return. Well, in tax years 2017 and 2018, so those are the tax returns that you'll actually do this year and next year, the new tax law will let individuals write off those medical expenses when they exceed just 7.5% of their adjusted gross income. And then in 2019, the deduction will go back to 10%. Finally, the new tax code streamlines the so-called standard deduction or individual exemption to $12,000 for single tax filers and $24,000 for joint tax filers. Now, experts predict that this increase in the standard deduction will lead to fewer people itemizing their taxes. And the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy projects that this will lead to a reduction of between $12 and $13 billion in the amount of money that people donate to various charities and nonprofit organizations. And one of these organizations is the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And obviously, if there's less money going to the society, there's less money available for everything. And ultimately, that's going to include research. Last October, when Bruce Bebo, the Executive Vice President of Research at the National MS Society, was on the podcast, he shared with us that just last year, the Society invested over $40 million in research. We don't want to see that number shrink, so this change in the tax law could have some indirect negative implications for any nonprofit organization that relies on donations. So while the media fascination with the new tax law seems to have ended, how it's actually going to impact all of us will only begin to be seen over the coming several months, and we'll keep you posted. Stem cell therapy is a hot topic for people living with multiple sclerosis. One stem cell treatment, called autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, or HSCT, and thank goodness for that abbreviation, has shown promising outcomes in treating MS. But there are other stem cell treatments that have not shown positive results, and the challenge for MS patients, some of whom are desperately searching for a treatment that promises a positive outcome, is that so much of what is being marketed to the public as proven stem cell therapy isn't. It seems like so-called stem cell clinics are popping up in cities across the United States and around the world, and some of them seem to be promising a miracle cure for almost any illness. And unfortunately, some of these clinics are only in business to take money from people who are ready to try anything to get better. So about 10 days ago, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration stepped in and sent a warning letter to a company called American Cryostem for marketing its stem cell product, which is called Atcell. Now, this letter gives American Cryostem 15 days to respond to the FDA's concerns. The concerns are pretty straightforward. Atcell has not been approved for use, but it's being distributed to physicians to treat patients with Parkinson's disease, ALS, stroke, and multiple sclerosis. The FDA said, and I quote, "The use of Atcell raises potential significant safety concerns due in part to the fact that there is little basis on which to predict how the product will perform in a patient. In addition, this product may also cause harm to patients who may put their trust in an unproven therapy and make the decision to delay or discontinue medical treatments proven to be safe and effective." Unquote. You know, as technology moves at a faster and faster pace, so does the speed of scientific discovery. And it's especially important as a medical consumer to do your homework when you're thinking about moving forward with a so-called emerging treatment. Now, it's not that they're all going to be good for you or bad for you, but you need to ask questions. You need to do some Google searches. You need to start separating the wheat from the marketing chaff in your own mind. And if things get confusing, then it's time to ask more questions. You know, it always surprises me that we're usually willing to invest more of our time in researching a potential vacation destination than we are in researching a potential medical treatment or procedure. No one asked us to become informed medical consumers, just like no one ever asked anyone if they wanted MS. But here we are. And we owe it to ourselves to be a full partner in our own medical treatment, and you can't be a full partner without first being fully informed. A researcher at the Kessler Foundation in New Jersey has received a $44,000 research grant from the National MS Society to study emotional processing challenges experienced by people living with MS. Some prior research has shown that MS diminishes social cognition, or the ability to interpret other people's feelings when you're interacting with them. An example of this emotional processing dysfunction is difficulty in recognizing other people's emotions or intentions by their facial expressions. So Dr. Helen Genova, the Assistant Director of Neuropsychology and Neuroscience Research at the Kessler Foundation, is going to test two different approaches to improving emotional processing for MS patients. One approach will have MS patients work with a computerized program that's designed to give them better facial recognition skills, and the other approach will use interactive training that uses examples from the patient's own emotional experiences. This approach has worked with patients with other diseases, but it's the first time it's going to be tried with MS patients. And this is such important work because if you can't accurately interpret other people's feelings, it can impact your relationships with your family, with your friends. It makes socializing more difficult. It can impact you at work, and it can even jeopardize your ability to keep your job. So the proposed approaches to this kind of treatment can make a real difference in how someone living with MS can function at home or with their friends, with their loved ones, or with their coworkers. It's no small thing. Dr. Genova is doing her research at the Rocco Ortenzio Neuroimaging Center at Kessler Foundation, which is a center dedicated solely to studying rehabilitation, and that is such an important aspect of treating MS that is too often overlooked or at least not given the appropriate weight and significance. But rehabilitation is what allows us to fully function in the everyday real world, and that's just another way of simply saying it provides us with our quality of life. In a moment, we'll welcome Dr. Maja Mataric to the podcast. I'm excited to have as my guest today Dr. Maja Mataric. Dr. Mataric is not a neurologist, but I'm convinced that the work that Dr. Mataric is doing has the potential to change the face of neurological rehabilitation and even long-term care for people living with any number of conditions, including multiple sclerosis. And I think it may also redefine caregiving for family members who are caring for a loved one at home. Dr. Mataric is a professor and the Chan Soon Chong Chair in the Computer Science Department, Neuroscience Program in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Southern California. She's the founding director of the USC Robotics and Autonomous Systems Center, the co-director of the USC Robotics Research Lab, and vice dean for research at the Viterbi School of Engineering at USC. Dr. Mataric is a recipient of the 2009 Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. She was named one of the 25 most powerful women in technology and one of the top 25 women in robotics. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Mataric.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, sure. As I said, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today because I believe your work is going to make a real difference for so many people. And I guess we should jump in at the beginning. I'm hoping you can explain to my listeners what a socially assistive robot is.
Well, about 15 years ago or so, I was looking around at where robotics would make the most difference. And it's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate now because robotics is booming and most people are aware that there's a boom in robotics, but it's not clear how it'll affect them directly other than maybe through, autonomous driving or maybe autonomous delivery through drones, etc. And when I looked at the field 15 years ago, I was particularly interested in looking at special needs populations. So I wanted to see where can robots make a difference in daily lives of people who actually need assistance as opposed to sort of more luxurious, opportunistic applications like autonomous driving and flying. And so I'm happy to say that in parallel with this boom in robotics we've had for about 15 years, development and piloting of autonomous robotic systems, which are trying to assist people in helping them meet their own, usually health-related and educational goals. So socially assistive robots are robots that help people through social interaction rather than physical help. And that's really interesting because when you think about robots, you think about machines that do physical work. Actually, the word robot comes from the Czech rabota, which means menial labor, right? So it's all about this kind of original physical work, whether it's on an assembly line or driving people around, but it's something physical, fetching and delivering. And what we found by looking at a lot of literature and then talking to a lot of people in healthcare and special needs more generally, was that what people needed was not so much to have someone else do work for them or something else do the work for them, but to find the strength, and by that I don't mean so much physical as psychological, emotional, motivation, drive to help themselves when they're facing some incredibly hard challenge, whether it's rehab, whether it's any kind of developmental or aging-related challenge. And so that's where we found a niche. And we said, well, okay, so a lot of people need a lot of help. What does robotics have to do with it? And the really interesting thing about neuroscience is that it shows in the last about 15, 20 years, there's this field of embodiment, neuroscience of embodiment. And it shows us that the way we're wired as physical creatures really determines how we interact socially and what affects our health. So it turns out that we are physical social creatures, and our physical social interactions drive our health and our motivation more than anything else. And so that's this foundation of the field of socially assisted robotics, is the idea that these robots help you get better by being your social peer in the physical world. They have to be physical and they have to be social.
So I'm someone who maybe has been treated in a hospital and has been discharged, and I have some rehabilitation to do. My disability makes it especially difficult for me to get to the place where I need to do that rehab work. And this happens quite often, actually. So given that, can a socially assistive robot be in my home helping me through doing some of the physical therapy work, things like that?
So indeed, the point of the point of the socially assistive robot is to help you overcome challenges that relate to whether you have the motivation to do the work that you're supposed to be doing. Like maybe you have to do some number of exercises per day or some amount of time, and that ends up being difficult to do. You somehow find yourself not doing it because you're too busy or you get distracted, and these are all implicit psychological reasons that we avoid doing things that are very challenging. So what the robot does is it doesn't physically get you anywhere. That's not its role. For that, you can use an autonomous car, right, or some other type of transportation. What it's about more is getting you physically to do what you aren't doing, whether it's because it's so psychologically difficult, it's so challenging, it's demoralizing, it's depressing. Let me give you an example from our early work. One of the areas of our very early work was in stroke rehabilitation. And we looked at what challenges stroke patients had in rehab. And in order to regain function that you have lost or even partially get better, you have to do a lot of activities of daily life with your affected limb. And that's very demoralizing, right? Because if I want to reach, let's say, for the coffee mug with my stroke-affected limb, I'm going to have a lot of trouble doing that. I might drop it. I'm certainly going to look really disabled to anyone observing me. So there's a lot of stigma and dissatisfaction in doing that. Whereas I could just use my other limb, let's say my left arm, which isn't stroke affected, and then nobody will know anything except I will not recover. So there's this really challenging problem, which is not that people who are not doing activities of daily life with their stroke affected limb are being lazy. It's that it is downright demoralizing and depressing to do rehabilitation exercises. So how do we get people motivated? How do we give them the emotional support and the social support to help themselves through a process which is inherently depressing and isolating? That's what we're trying to get at. But if you don't have a wonderful friend who's going to be with you 24/7 to support you in this journey of recovery, then at least you can have a socially assisted robot who's going to be a companion to assist you in this recovery process. That's the point.
I'm wondering, can that robot remind me if I need to take medication?
So the robot can certainly remind you. And in fact, reminder systems are becoming more ubiquitous, but reminding someone to do what they need to do is not a very effective way to do it. So most people who don't do what they need to do are not doing it not because they forgot. They even might believe that they forgot, but they actually don't want to do it. And why don't they want to do it? Well, because it's really challenging. It's challenging for a variety of reasons, emotionally, psychologically, cognitively. It's challenging. So it isn't about, it's like medication adherence. Medication adherence is a great example where People have been thinking for years and years how to make a smart pill box, which is going to nudge you and nag you to take the right pill. Well, I have a mother who is now 83 years old, and when she needed to take an extra pill, and she's quite healthy, fortunately, but when she, had some number of pills that she was taking to regulate blood pressure, whatever, and then she had to take another one, let's say for her thyroid, she said, well, I don't want to take that extra one. That makes me feel old. So there are all sorts of psychological reasons why we have issues with adhering to medical regimens. And taking medication, every time you take a medication, you are reminded that there's something wrong with it. So that's a part of the reason why people don't take medication. And it's important to understand that it isn't about forgetting. It's not about just telling them what time of day it is. It's like saying, oh, if I remind you not to eat fatty food and I remind you that exercise is healthy, then you're going to not eat fatty food and exercise more. Has that ever worked?
And not so much.
That's the point. So that's the point. The point is that behavior change is really challenging, and we have to have the motivation to help ourselves. And there's a lot of neuroscience to back that any kind of behavior change, whether it's rehabilitation from a physical disability all the way to brain implant patients, we need to want to make something happen. You have to have that volitional drive that is driving your behavior in your brain. And to make that happen, well, why are you going to want to do something if you might feel isolated, depressed, or disabled? That's where the social factors come in, to give us support to make us change what we need to change.
So it sounds like you get a new best friend when you get a socially assistive robot.
Well, you definitely get a friend. One hopes that there's always one or more human best friends. But, the human support system is complex. For people with disabilities and special needs, there's always the loneliness of, a variety of social factors, in fact, including being ostracized. I work a lot with the autism population. And so I think what we're trying to say here is we're not trying to replace human friends, but we're trying to bridge the gap in care. Everyone deserves the best of care. And this is a way to fill in what is missing.
Well, I think that might even have a secondary benefit to the humans who are providing care, in the sense that they're going to feel a little less overwhelmed and maybe a little less, a few less cases of caregiver burnout over time.
Well, thank you for saying that. That is exactly our goal. And if you look at it from the outside and don't really understand the bigger picture, then there might be fear that we're talking about job displacement. And we really aren't trying to displace human caregivers, because the need for human caregivers is vast, but there's just not enough people who are available and trained and properly compensated to do that work. And so this is absolutely bridging the gap and helping them, not taking them out of the picture.
What are the costs associated with a socially assistive robot, or is it even too soon to be able to estimate what those might be?
I don't think it's too soon. And I think, in fact, the costs are much lower than anybody would anticipate. I think now, if you think about producing machines that have to manipulate the world, that's expensive, right? So if you want me to take a person with a physical disability and pick them up and carry them safely across the room, that is very expensive. But if you want to have a robot that sits next to you, sort of watches, observes your facial expressions, maybe takes some physiologic data at the same time, encourages you to do things, knows things about you, helps you along, for it can be much more affordable for the users. In a matter of the next few years, literally 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to be seeing more and more companies deploying these kinds of products into people's homes. And initially, the products won't be particularly useful, but they're going to build. And so very soon, we're actually going to have these things which will start to be covered by insurance, and they will not be that expensive. It'll be, let's say the cost of a cell phone or a laptop, right? So that's not very much. We're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars now on affordable kinds of systems. We're talking about at the level of a cell phone or a laptop, which is still not super cheap for all populations. It's not for every demographic yet. But if you consider the penetration of cell phones, this is not that different.
That's remarkable. Back in the 1990s, I felt pretty certain that I'd be piloting my flying car by now. And unfortunately, that still hasn't happened, especially when I'm trying to traverse LA traffic. But, on a more serious note, when it comes to starting to see socially assistive robots in our homes, it sounds like that is much, much more within our grasp today.
It is. That's a really good comparison you make, because today, if you want to have an autonomous car, you have to pay quite a bit, because the very high-end vehicles are partially autonomous. They're not fully autonomous, but you could buy a very high-end vehicle, or not. Well, it depends what people consider high-end, but for about $100,000 and up, you can get cars that are partially autonomous. But that's not particularly accessible, right? And affordable. Whereas with socially assisted robotics, as I said, the entry-level systems are going to be much more affordable. Then the question becomes, how general purpose are they? But there have already been apps that have started to show people how to do some types of behavior change. So, for example, I'm going to pick out Headspace for meditation. Meditation and kind of, sleep management and anxiety. So that's a wonderful example of a low-cost technology, and some level of service is even free, that is available on your phone. Now, it doesn't work for a lot of people, and adherence is a big issue, et cetera, but it does work for some, and like I said, it's accessible and affordable. So now if you think of a step up where you have a social companion that helps you with that kind of thing, that is on the order of, a cost of a laptop, that is, much, much more affordable for so many more people. And then people are starting to develop all kinds of software. It's interesting, people are developing software for interactive agents already, and they're doing it for entertainment purposes, but this will all get leveraged for health purposes as well. So it's a really good alignment to technology development.
Wow, it sounds amazing, and yet it sounds like it's literally springing up around us as we speak. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it. I know it's going to get a lot of our listeners thinking about things that they may not have considered before when they thought about things like rehabilitation and caregiving and what the next steps might be. So thank you for everything you do, and certainly for spending a few minutes with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
That's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. To those of you who have sent in your feedback and your suggestions, I just want to let you know that I read all of it and I appreciate all of it. So if you haven't gotten in touch yet, it's John Strum, JONSTRUM @realtalkms.com, or you can just visit the realtalkms.com website and fill in our contact form. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, remember you can find it on Apple iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Music Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and of course, our website at www.realtalkms.com. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.